In this second lecture, we consider a second key aspect of who God is. The first, we considered that God is a giver. In this second lecture, we consider God as the forgiver. In an Australian film, it's 10 years old now, The Man Who Sued God, Billy Connolly plays Steve Myers, a lawyer who became a fisherman from frustration, and his one piece of property, his boat, is struck by lightning and destroyed. He's denied his insurance money because it was deemed an act of God. So he re-registers a lawyer and sues the insurance company and the church under the guise of God. I'll show you a clip of that a little later in the module. Like many movies, this is essentially a simple story of revenge, although it's a comedy and done in a humorous way. When bad things happen, it is human nature to blame someone, whether it be an insurance company or the church or even God. And the real hook in this film is the idea of putting God in the dock, to borrow a phrase from C.S. Lewis. A delightful reversal. Rather than God calling us to account for the way things are, we call God to account for the way things are. And we see this drama of blame and revenge all around us, from preschool-age children right through to the childish ways our political leaders often do business. From the bedroom to the boardroom, from the classroom, the online forum, we often accuse, point the finger, and even plot payback. But God is the God who forgives. And humans forgive because God forgives. In fact, humans are to forgive as God forgives. Human forgiveness is found by echoing God's forgiveness. But that does not sound like how most Christians get along. What has happened to our idea of God as a forgiving God? Well, like we saw earlier, not only is God the giver perverted into forms that are unrecognisable, God as a negotiator or even God as a lovely grandfather, but God's forgiveness is also perverted. And the first way God's forgiveness is perverted is into God as a harsh and inflexible judge. Some of us may have seen over the Christmas break the second time a film's been made of the classic Les Miserables, this time with Hugh Jackman and Russell Crowe in the lead roles. And like the Russell Crowe character, Inspector Javert has a relentless pursuit of the wrongdoer, Valjean. Or another older film that was a favourite a couple of decades ago, Dead Poets Society with Rowan Williams, where the school headmaster, Mr. Nolan, both of these figures, Inspector Javert, Headmaster Nolan, are images of this harsh and inflexible judge, someone who applies the letter of the law. Yet punishment is a very rough tool, some might say an inadequate tool for dealing with wrongdoing, as both Inspector Javert in Les Miserables and Mr. Nolan in Dead Poets Society discover. Sometimes our politicians love to talk about punishment that fits the crime. But I wonder what kind of punishment fits the unspeakably evil crimes we see against humanity witnessed in mass genocides, even thinking over the last century, from Hitler to Stalin to Pol Pot to Rwanda to Darfur to what we currently see happening in Syria. Doesn't punishment alone falter before the enormity of such crimes, where hundreds of millions of lives have been destroyed? And then we go to the other end of the spectrum. What if every person, you and I included, were to be punished for every single transgression, every sarcastic remark, every unkind thought, every intentionally misleading comment? At this point we see that every honest assessment of the human condition, from the Apostle Paul in the New Testament to the Reformer Luther, even to the atheistic philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who said to live is to be unjust, has concluded that all humans, all humanity, is under the power of sin and live unjust lives before the eyes of a just God. And so, if God is harsh and inflexible, then we do not have the forgiveness that we all need and that humanity needs. So at this point, the return of God the lovely grandpa is likely to make an appearance. Remember that God who never says no to his favourite granddaughter, that little girl who is her favourite, his favourite. We too can imagine ourselves as God's favourite, thinking we're basically good. As long as we don't hurt anyone, God will smile upon us like Grandpa. What we think, feel and desire is nobody else's business, not even God's. That we'll be affirmed no matter what we have done or who we've become. Now, these kinds of ideas are not just found among those outside the church. We will see and consider later on in this course that there are some schools of thought within Christian theology where ideas of God's wrath, God's anger, God's judgment, God's condemnation is somehow outdated, repressive, even barbaric, and that what we should be placing a greater emphasis on is God's love. Well, there's obviously both ways you can get this out of balance, but here we need to realise that in responding to God as a harsh and inflexible judge, we don't also make the equal and opposite mistake of turning God into someone who never judges anyone or anything. You see, although I find the idea of God not judging me to be an attractive idea, I'm not consistent. Trouble flares in a place like East Timor or a remote indigenous community or Syria, where vulnerable women and children are harmed, and I cannot imagine that God is not angry. Or a place like Warai in a remote Northern Territory, where rival gangs make it inhospitable for Indigenous children and their mothers. I dare not imagine that God is smiling warmly at what goes on there. Or in my decade working in the inner city of Sydney, where I'd often see young mothers put themselves and their children's lives at risk in order to make ends meet. I cannot imagine God is pleased. You see, once I accept God's judgment, God's condemnation of wrongdoing, there is no way of keeping it out there for others. I must bring it home as well. At some level, we all resist the notion of a wrathful God because we dread being the target of that wrath. But neither can we escape with the twisted logic of the mob boss Tony Soprano in the TV series, who on the one hand believed that God would excuse his own violence and wrongdoing, on the other hand condemn only the really bad people like the Hitlers and Pol Pots, as he called them, the twisted and demented criminals. Now, we cannot have it both ways. God judging everyone else, but only loving us. So in order to understand who God is, we must affirm that God is both loving and gives good gifts to us, but that God is also forgiving because he does not just affirm us indiscriminately. The world has gone wrong, we have gone wrong. And so God both gives and forgives, and that is very much the heart of who God is in Christian theology.